Welcome to the Black Writers Studio, a podcast presented by the Hurston Wright Foundation and hosted by Dr. Khadijah Ali Coleman. The Black Writers Studio is dedicated to showcasing Black writers who are transforming the world today with their literary pen and creating a legacy for the culture. Mark Anthony Neal is the James B. Duke Distinguished Professor of African and African American Studies, Professor of English, and Professor of Gender, Sexuality and Feminist Studies, and Chair of the Department of African and African American Studies at Duke University. He teaches courses in Black popular culture, including signature courses on the history of Black humor, Black masculinity, and Motown American Culture. Dr. Neal is the author of 6 books, including the recently published Black Ephemera, The Crisis and Challenge of the Musical Archive. Dr. Neal has been featured in several documentaries and television shows, and is producer and host of the Webby-nominated video podcast, Left of Black, produced in collaboration with the John Hope Franklin Humanities Institute at Duke. Dr. Neal's next book, Save a Seat for Me, Meditations on Black Masculinity and Fatherhood, will be published by Simon Schuster. So I cannot believe that I actually am in conversation with you because I'm such a social media groupie. And I feel like I share everything that you put out there. One of the things that really just amazes me is the way that you really navigate these spaces that you are centered in. You're an icon academically, but yet you are so entrenched in popular culture as a critic, as a participant. You have your own books. And so I'm really interested to know how did that, I think you're kind of an ideal for most academics to be
Yeah.
able to exist in this academic world, but be so relevant to contemporary
Yeah.
thinkers. How did that come about?
Authenticity was always important to me, right? And I know authenticity is a whole fraught word and trying to be real and all those kinds of things. But, because I was a working class kid, came up out of the South Bronx, had a daddy who couldn't read, I had a mama who, by the will of God, pushed me forward into the world. I never wanted to do any kind of work as an academic
Mm,
that didn't bring value to the lives of the kind of people that raised me.
mm,
That my parents in particular, right? My father is someone who couldn't read. I didn't want to do any work that he could not find some value in
wow.
some sort of context. And for my career, that has kept me grounded in a certain kind of way. So on the one hand, never get so caught up in the academic life, but also in the kind of work that I do, that
Mm.
it always remained work that I think in its rootedness was grounded in the lives of everyday Black folk.
Yeah. In speaking of your work, you have a book now. Last year was its 10-year anniversary, Looking for Leroy, Illegible Black Masculinities. And
Yeah.
author John L. Jackson, he said about your book, Mark Anthony Neal is one of our most consistently interesting and inspiring critics of contemporary Black popular culture and music. And he says that the book showcases your masterful ability to take iconic figures of Black masculinity from Avery Brooks to Sean Carter, who we know as Jay-Z, and show them to us in an entirely new light. And so I'm wondering, I ask you how you even became engaged. So as you just shared, you wanted your academic work to be accessible to people who aren't
Mhm.
necessarily in college, right?
Right, right.
But how did you even become engaged in this work that focuses on the lives and the expressions of Black people? And I ask you this particularly because I've always wanted, this is like 5 questions in one. I've always wanted to know also if you were a musician. So I've had the privilege at this point to interview a couple of musicologists. And so I'm wondering, because, a lot of your work hones in on the work of Black
Hmm.
music
Hmm.
makers and the
Hmm.
historical impact of Black music. So that was a lot. And let me know if you need me to
No,
retract, but how did you even get into this,
I
what you
got
do?
that. So I'm not a musician. I can't read music. I can't play an instrument. But music was a space where my father and I found common grounding, right? I describe him as my first intellectual interlocutor, in part because, given his life and his work life and all those kinds of things, the space of recovery that he found for himself was in music. And
Mm,
just as a child, 3, 4 years old, watching him sitting entranced on Sunday afternoons, listening to the Mighty Clouds of Joy, Bobby Blue Bland, Jimmy Smith, and Jimmy McGriff, the two Hammond three players, there was just something really fascinating about it. So our relationship began really when he allowed me to come into that world with him, to
mm,
start digging in his crates. Both of my parents were wise enough to get me my first stereo system when I was 7 years old, because they could already discern a kind of love of music that I had. And I tell the story in Black Ephemera in the beginning of it about how when I was 5 years old in a 9 month period, I'm five, this is 1971, New York City. And in a 9 month period, my parents took me to see the Jackson Five, Aretha Franklin, and the Supremes. And it
mm,
was like they introduced me into this world of music just as music lovers, not knowing it was something that I would take on. So I always became fascinated in music and wanting to talk about its social aspects, right? So
mm,
while I don't know any notes and I don't play any music, I've been fascinated with the social function of Black music, whether it's in terms of dance, community, as a way to articulate political realities and social realities for Black folks. And, I'd be remiss not to talk about, when I was in college and a young writer, the influence of people like Nelson George and his book, The Death of Rhythm and Blues,
mhm.
the impact of being able to read Greg Tate 2 or 3 times a month in the Village Voice, reading folks like Lisa Jones, eventually reading, Joan Morgan, who I grew up with, have known since we both were 3 years old in 1967.
Oh, wow,
Uh,
wow.
yes.
So you
Um,
mean grow up like you knew her personally, not with her work. That's fantastic.
no, there are photos circulating in the internet of us and our graduation outfits from Head Start,
Wow.
back in 1969. So yeah, like seriously grew up. Yes.
Right, right. That's fantastic. So you mentioned Black Ephemera.
Hmm.
You released that book 2 years ago, 2022.
2022. Yeah.
Yeah, and so it's marketed as questioning the crisis and the challenge of the Black musical archive in a moment when Black American culture has become a global export. And so you argue that Black music has itself been reduced to ephemera at best and at worst in the background sounds of the continued exploitation and commodification of Black culture. So I interviewed Ishmael Reed last year, and I was
Mhm,
taken by his
mhm,
take on
mhm,
publishing today, where he says that today publishing is largely controlled by the salesman, right? And
mhm,
so I connect this to your thesis in
mhm,
Black Ephemera. And so as an academic, a cultural archivist, someone with your ears always plugged. I mean, folks that are listening that aren't familiar with the breadth of your work, they can really start with your blog,
mhm.
right?
Yeah.
But as an academic, can you talk a little bit about this view as it relates to publishing and our literary landscape and define for us what you mean when you talk about
Ooh.
ephemera, because this whole idea of ephemeral everything
Mhm.
is really becoming more of our lexicon, and people are becoming more attuned to that. What do you mean by that?
So let me start with Reed and I will disagree forever around his gender politics. Just to kind of lay that out. But what he has meant as a cultural critic and someone who has observed Black culture over now 60 years, and the way that he crafted the essay form in the 1970s, 1980s, when I think about the work that I do as an essayist,
Mm,
the most influential writer for me was Ishmael Reed, right? Because it was polemical, but it was also smart. It was insightful. It was thoughtful. Um, the style, was not simply on the page, it was doing all these other things.
Mhm.
So, when I hear that critique from Reed at this point about what's happening in publishing, I'm sensitive to it, right? And I'm particularly sensitive to it with this book, in the sense that I'm 58 years old. It was published when I was 56. In my mind, there's no question it's the best book I've ever written because
Mhm.
I've been able to utilize the full wealth and breadth of my knowledge and my skill set and my experience to make an argument that I've been trying to make my whole career, that I finally got the career, that I finally got it
Mhm.
said. And ironically, it's the book of mine that has been read the least. Right.
Wow.
But part of that is about the shift, right? And the book was a polemic that was doing a couple of things. On the one hand, just thinking about the way that Black culture generally and Black music specifically has become disposable.
Mhm.
It's just out there on the internet. No one cares for Black culture enough to curate it in a way that intellectually it makes sense.
Mhm.
So we find people borrowing, we talk about culture bandits, and some of that is intentional, but some of it just folks who just don't know any better. And let me just loop this song, and I don't really know the name of the artist, but it doesn't matter. Right. So there's no value that is parlayed to Black culture because it's seen as something that's disposable that you can just borrow, run with, remake and do something else with. And so I was really concerned at this point in time with the proliferation of Black culture, right? There's Black culture everywhere because of digital culture,
Mhm.
that the actual cultural DNA of Black culture is being lost, right?
Mm.
We forget. I mean, like the conversation we're having now
Mhm.
about Beyonce and country music,
Mhm.
which is fine, right? And she's an amazing performer, and I could even argue now that she might now have outpaced Michael Jackson, right?
Mhm.
Which is something I never thought I could have imagined seeing, let alone say.
Mhm.
Given all that said, she's going to make a popular song that references country music, but in the context of a popular fan base and even young critics who don't know any better, they have no idea of 100-year trajectory of Black folks who have contributed to something that we now call country music.
Mhm.
Millie Jackson was making country music albums
Mhm. Mhm.
in the
Mhm.
1970s, let alone folks who were actually country stars like a Charlie Pride and folks like that.
Mhm.
And that's just a small example of what concerned me in the industry and broadly in terms of Black culture, that folks just don't appreciate and respect it enough to name it for what it is because it's become a commodity. It
And
literally,
can I
yeah. Yeah.
just interject a second to say when we are even talking about ephemeral, it's this idea of something that is temporary,
Right, that disappears.
that
Right, at
disappears.
that time, that disappears.
Right,
Absolutely.
right, right.
When I play music in my classes, and when I was coming through as a college student, or even as in grade school, right, someone's playing music. I was like, okay, that's we get to listen to some good stuff. The
Mhm.
challenge of getting students in a classroom to listen to music when you play it,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Because they're not socialized in the culture in which you pay attention to music like that. It's always
Mhm.
background noise, right?
Yes.
If it doesn't have a beat that makes you feel a certain kind of way, it's almost irrelevant. And so those were the things that were concerned to me, right? But it also was a shot across the bow to young critics
Mhm.
who suddenly have platforms that for those of us 20, 25 years ago never had access to, right? Both in terms of the highest level of folks who are doing cultural reporting, but just the proliferation of podcasts and blogs and all these kinds of things, right? That there's a responsibility that comes to doing critical work, which is also about reading and listening to the past, right? Everything is not about this moment, right? What we see, and this is going to happen with Beyonce soon. She'll drop this album, and everybody will be in a race to be the first one to write a review of the album
Mhm.
5 seconds after the album is available.
Mhm.
That doesn't contribute to the culture.
Mhm.
That contributes to the eyeballs of whatever publications you're writing for, right?
Mhm.
And they'll get what they get out of it, and then they'll move on to something else, right? And in that
Mhm.
context, there is not a great um, representation or documentation of why this was important in the first place.
Right.
When I first started doing, music journalism and doing some cultural criticism, I used to love you would get advanced copies of an album like a month before,
Mhm.
and you got to live with it.
Right.
Figure out how it sounds, pay attention to what it's also gesturing to in
Mm-hmm.
terms of contemporary artists who were peers, but also folks who came before them. And
Mm-hmm.
you could write something,
Right.
right, that spoke to the fullness of that. And so we're not even
And
doing
you
the
were
good.
expected to be knowledgeable
Oh,
of
absolutely.
precedent, to be able to
Absolutely.
make those comparisons and to be able to discuss it and
Look,
thoroughly enough to give folks context of where it exists within the
uh,
musical landscape.
I mean, look, I came up reading, Black music criticism. I mentioned Nelson George and Greg Tate.
Mm-hmm.
I'd be remiss not to mention the late, great Amiri Barak in this
Oh,
context.
yes, right.
I tell students today, you can't talk about Black music unless you sit down and spend some time with blues music, blues
Mm-hmm.
people,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's a foundational text, right? And what you learn from Baraka and Ellison, and people like Lisa Jones and all these great critics who have been writing about Black music for so long. The scholar Eileen Southern being another example, is that if you're going to represent this culture, you got to know the culture.
Mm-hmm.
It can't
Mm-hmm.
be a surface engagement, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have to have a foot deep in the culture,
Mm-hmm.
right? As Avery Brooks would say, in
Mm-hmm.
order to really appreciate what this is. And we have young critics now who, one, are not in editorial spaces where they're even editors,
Mm-hmm.
right? To push them to think that way. When you talk to all those folks, Black folks who went through the Village Voice in the 80s and the 90s, and they talk about how important a figure like, a white critic, Robert Christgau was for them, right? Because he pushed them, right? Nelson George talked about sending, and he posted this on Facebook a few weeks ago, sending Christgau a piece in 1976, and Christgau was like, "Oh yeah, it's good, but nah," right? And what that did was to force Nelson to go back to the lab, to go back to the woodshed, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
we don't have those kinds of relationships now with young writers and editors, right? Young
Right.
writers, I hear don't even want to be edited, which is like astounding to me, right? And I
Right.
get
Right.
it,
Right. Right. Right.
right?
Right. Right.
There's not a time I've worked with an editor and at some point not wanting to punch an editor in the face, right? That's kind of the nature of the relationship, right?
Right.
But ultimately, the intent is to want to make the writing better, more
Right.
accessible, and more powerful.
Well, I think you're bringing up a really good point because what you are ultimately talking about are think pieces. And so how
Right,
so
right,
much of the writing now is absent of it is purely opinion, and
yep,
that opinion is not mired in any idea of precedence. And
right,
so it really is about the headline, the potential headline grabbing to
yep,
get readers,
yep.
but not necessarily to have a substantive article
Conversation,
that
right.
speaks to the context in which this work exists. That I think that speaks a lot to our idea of journalism in general, but also how connected our media, our journal, our critiques is to the actual work.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
I think I am excited about this conversation because I think, and it saddens me when you say that that book is your least read, but I think it's because it was before its time. It was for now, and it came out a little bit earlier before people's vocabulary and consciousness caught up to it. But I think that this is what we're talking about right now. And even when we talk about ephemeral anything, we think of graffiti, we think of things
Mhm,
that are not necessarily considered part of a canon or
mhm,
valuable enough to be archived or
mhm,
considered. And so a lot of your work is around this archiving,
mhm,
this interpretive creation of digital access, but you are a lot of times critically considering it. So tell me
mhm,
about this work because this is also, I'm in that intersection of academia and nonprofit work and the arts,
mhm,
right? And so
uh-huh,
what I'm seeing is a lot when I'm wearing my nonprofit hat and looking for grants and things and to fund this work that we do with the Hurston Wright Foundation, what it has become very obvious to me is this importance of narratives, oral history collecting, archival work, which has
mhm,
really
mhm.
grown. If we're looking comparison to past years, this is what you've been doing for years.
Yeah.
You've been doing this work
Thank
um,
you. Thank you for
without
acknowledging that.
you
Yeah.
have been doing this work without it being connected necessarily to the scholarship and those things that are connected to your academic hat. You have been
Hmm.
doing this work tell me about your where you how you why you started to do the work that you do with your blog. Your blog is not, when we think of blog and we think of these think pieces, someone just telling
Right,
me that
right.
you are collecting, you are scouring the internet for these things of work that's not necessarily your own. Tell me about that.
Yeah, that has been a labor of love, and one that unfortunately I can't continue these days to the extent that I used
Um,
to in the past. But when the internet thing was first popping off, one of the things I used to do is that I would find five, six, seven essays or things and I would include some of our work in it, right? That I found really interesting. And I created this email list called Critical Noir.
mm,
And I would just send these blasts to 150 people, close friends, academics, and stuff like that. And for me, it just made sense. I see myself as someone, not as a gate in a gatekeeper sense, but someone who can kind of get through all the muck and mire of what's out there, curate it in a way, and to present it to people who may not necessarily have the same sensibility or time to go through all of these things, right? And because, when, I'm still of the mindset, then I read that when I read something that's really powerful, and I might be jealous for a moment, and I might miss for a moment, damn, I wish I would have wrote that. But I'm going to share that because the piece is a contribution to the culture, as is the sharing of that piece. I joke all the time, my friend Jelani Cobb, who's now the dean of journalism school up at Columbia, every time I would read something from Jelani, I would have to go back to the woodshed. That was just, I was like, okay, I got to work on my craft, right? And for me, that was important. And so that was kind of the spirit of, what my former student, Treva Lindsay, calls, critical generosity, right?
mhm,
In that sense. When suddenly the internet shows up and particularly blogging showed up, and I started, New Black Man in 2005, which was the year that the first edition of New Black Man dropped, right? And so I did it initially solely to promote New Black Man. The only other two people who I knew that had blogs at the time were Melissa Harris, then Lacewell, now Perry, and Mark Lamont Hill. And it didn't make any sense to me. It's like, why would I write something like this where I might get paid to write someplace and get more eyeballs? It didn't make any sense to me, right? When the book dropped in 2005, okay, this is a nice way to begin to promote the work. But at some point, I realized, no, this would actually be a much better use as a gateway,
mhm,
right? To be able to accumulate all the great stuff that's out there, to be able to get some young writers and young scholars to be able to write original work. Michael Denzel Smith, for instance, wrote a small piece on the blog, before he was Michael Denzel Smith. I mean, there's so
mhm,
many different examples of folks that I can think of,
mhm,
in that context, right? Who've now become serious folks, both as scholars and journalists. I wanted to be able to have that space. I also wanted to be able to pull stuff from the NPRs and the PBSs and all this kind of stuff, so that if folks were really interested in what's happening to Black culture, right, they could go to this space
mhm,
and find out. And then when social media happened, and it was a really beautiful period of time, I would say, for the blog between like 2013 and 2017, right? Before
mhm.
Twitter went crazy,
Right.
where it was just beautiful to be able to post stuff and then share it in multiple locations. And I was really proud of the work that we did initially with New Black Man and then eventually New Black Man in Exile. And for the most part, it's all been me. It's
Mm.
all with me, in terms of that, right? And one of the things that we could spring out of that was the work that we then began to do with Left of Black.
Yeah. I and I hear you when you say that you may not be able to give attention to that in the way that you have before. Would you say that a lot of that has to do with the ways that we're engaging with digital content in addition to your responsibilities? And if it is the former, what are some of the areas that you see your work shifting to in terms,
Yeah.
from a blog to what now?
It's a both and. People just, I find it hard, for instance, to leave Twitter.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not because I necessarily have any kind of romantic tie to it. But Black Twitter became Black Twitter because it was something about the functioning of this space, right? The
Yeah.
stuff that Andre Brock talks about that made it easy to do the kinds of work that we wanted to do, right? What I
Right. Right.
loved about Twitter and still can't be translated over to IG or TikTok and even Facebook to some extent is that it was link based,
Right.
right? It was a perfect shareable space.
Right.
And if you had information, it made it easy for you to share that information using hypertext, right? To be able to push that stuff out in the world. And I always say I will stay with Twitter until it just breaks,
Right.
until the technology doesn't work, right? I have
Right.
not seen anything else that helps me replicate any of that. But even in the context of that now, Twitter has become much younger, as lack of a better way to describe it, both in terms of age, but also in terms of intellectual maturity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right. So the kinds of things and people that would find stuff that I'm interested in interesting have largely disappeared.
Mm-hmm.
So I've had to figure out different kinds of strategies for that.
Mm-hmm.
People are more apt to not want to go someplace for information.
Mm-hmm.
They'd rather have it come to them.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And things of that nature. So it's just a different, I think, digital infrastructure, for me to maintain the kind of level of attention I had to pay to the blog before then, right? And the other thing is just professional demands. I've been chairing the Department of African American Studies here at Duke since 2017.
Mm-hmm.
I'm an older, more senior scholar, so there's just more, demands on my time generally.
Right. Right.
And I got a grandson, so
Oh, congratulations. Right.
thank you.
Oh, wow. Well, my last question really speaks to that academic question, particularly as we're seeing um all of the legislature kind of changing around colleges, from admissions to just protections of scholars and being able to do their work without being deemed in violation of, amendment rights. And I call it the shifting gates of academia. How do you see this space impacting the work you do as a scholar, and how you engage in your own work, your own written work? Are you seeing pushback, particularly
Yeah.
the emphasis on a Black expression?
So, I am a Black studies child, right? Intellectually, I was raised on the idea and value of Black studies and Black studies from its most recent formation as we understand it in the 1960s, because obviously it existed before then. But when it first comes to colleges and universities, right, there was always an understanding that the demand for Black studies came from both students on campus, but also from the streets.
Mm-hmm.
And because the streets demanded Black studies in these spaces, it meant that Black studies has always had to be accountable on some level to the streets.
Mm-hmm.
That the work that we produce, the scholarship we produce, whether or not it's stuff that's accessible or not, in some way has to be able to resonate with regular Black folks who never make it to these institutions, right? Who,
Mm-hmm.
as when they were our age, weren't even allowed to consider
Yes.
these institutions. What has been important to me in terms of thinking about Black studies in that way is that my own work has always been outward. We talk about folks in terms of being Black public intellectuals, right? And we know that people who are famous and celebrities and have TV shows and all, and those folks are critically important in terms of taking complex conversations about Black life and presenting them to a lay audience of all races.
Mm-hmm.
But I always go back to the example of the late Manning Marable, who for 20 years, while he was this amazing scholar, he would do this weekly column called Beyond the Color Line,
Mm-hmm.
which he offered to the independent Black press free of charge for
Mm-hmm.
them to run, right? Just as a way to have substantive conversations. And what the internet and social media allowed was for me to do that, right? In the way that, say, a Manning Marable did that for print media.
Mm-hmm.
What it means for me is that as we see these kinds of DEIB attacks and attacks on Black studies at universities, right, that we can't get so caught up that these spaces are the only spaces where we do the work, right? There's always going to be a need for the work that we do outside of the university, right? So we always have to be looking on both sides. So for me, I'm worried for those institutions in states where this is a real issue, like
Mm-hmm.
Texas and Florida and some other places.
Mm-hmm.
I'm less concerned in institutions that have relative resources and wealth to be able to sustain Black Studies programs, but that also means it's an elite project in and of itself, an
Mm-hmm.
elitist
Right.
project in and of itself, including the kinds of students that it
Right.
impacts, right? And I always fundamentally believe that, for Black scholars, Black Studies programs at these elite institutions, there's a responsibility to utilize the resources of these spaces to be able to impact folks who don't have to come to these spaces.
Exactly. Exactly.
For a decade, I co-taught a history of hip hop class with the great Ninth Wonder, Grammy Award nominated producer,
Mm-hmm.
giving them a shout out. The class would have about 130 students, when we taught it every spring.
Mm-hmm.
75% of those students would be white,
Right.
right? So that's right. But we opened the class up to the public. We taught it on a Wednesday evening after work, and there would always be 15, 20 folks from the HBCU, North Carolina Central down the road, just random folks who were interested, who would just come and sit in the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I remember when we first did, it's like, oh, do we have to sign something? Do we have to? No, don't say a word. Just show up and sit in the class. And for me, that's a model on how Black Studies is going to be able to navigate this particular moment. Because we can't have a future of Black Studies if we can't translate the knowledge of Black Studies to younger folks coming up.
Right.
Right. And part of the attacks on teaching Black Studies in K through 12 and all this ridiculous talk about, critical race theory and all this kind of stuff, though thank God we hear very little of that today, is this idea that they are trying to disrupt that pipeline. Right, because it is that historical pipeline, right? The folks who took stuff, the folks in the Harlem Renaissance who passed this stuff on to the Black arts movement, who passed it on to the hip hop generation, right? And many of these folks, I use Jelani Cobb's example again, right? This is a hip hop head who's the dean of the journalism school at Columbia. Right. There are many hip hop heads who are lawyers and doctors and running institutions, running foundations and all these kinds of things. And part of these attack is about the disruption of the transference of Black knowledge from one generation to the other. Right. So on the
Yes.
one hand, it gets devalued. Right. So it's not seen as something that's of value anywhere, but people who are still articulating value in it, we need to disrupt the roots in which they're trying to communicate this to younger folks.
Yes. Wow. That's it. That if there was a mic, that is dropped. We are done. I would like for this episode to actually be a continuance of your message. And so if you are open to sharing with our listeners how where you would recommend they start when it comes to your work, where they can get it. What I typically ask authors is if there's a bookstore, but for you, not necessarily a bookstore, where would you like folks to start when it comes to your work, which is so readily available online, from
I,
your
I,
blogs to your
yeah.
books?
I think you go to the blog. I've started, taking some of the work on the blog and moving it over to Medium.
I noticed that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, but I would just, you could do a Google search and so many things come up. I will say the stuff that I am most proud of, the work that I do in the Netflix documentary, The Two Killings of Sam Cooke,
Mm,
really was important to me. The work that I just did, for the Skip Gates documentary, Gospel, is really important. In terms of books, I would definitely start with Soul Babies,
mm-hmm.
because it really is me kind of, for the first time, doubling down on why Black popular culture is critically important
Mm-hmm.
to both our political and intellectual project at this period of time. And Left to Black is the other thing, right? One of the things we've been able to do, like the great work that you're doing, with the Black Writers Studios, that for 14 years we've been doing this show, Left to Black,
Mm-hmm.
a video podcast, and our strategy for it was always evergreen, meaning that we rarely do episodes that are about what's happening in current news. that would not have any value, say 2 weeks later, right? So it's really a book conversation. It is an artistic conversation, stuff that people can continue to go back to years after we have the conversation.
Yes.
And I would argue that that's the best work that I've done because it allowed me to create a platform to talk to writers, to talk to artists. The way that I felt fulfilled watching Gil Noble and Like It Is, when I was growing up in New York City in the 70s, the way I was fulfilled sitting in Black male barbershops in the 70s and 80s, right? And just listening to all this wide array of knowledge, right? Some of which can't be repeated, but that was part
Right.
of the process. I always thought there were not enough places in culture, right? Whether we're talking media, communications, entertainment, that simply love on Black knowledge. And what I have tried to do, what we've tried to do now with the Franklin Humanities Institute and my director, Eric Barstow, is to create a space in which we love on Black knowledge.
And you have been such a model for people like me. As you know, I expressed to you earlier before we began, um, and trying not to be a fangirl. I do want to articulate to you personally in your face that you are definitely a model for many of us who are trying to continue this tradition of work in terms of loving on Black knowledge, amplifying the work that has come before, that continues to imprint and to impress upon us who we were, where we are going, and there is inherent value in that and continued value in that. And so I thank you just deeply for your work, for the work that you've invested in that hasn't been part of your occupation. It's evident, it's palpable, and it is appreciated. And so I just thank you so much for taking time out of your day to talk to me today. Thank you so much, Professor. You are extreme value to me and to our people. Thank you.
Thank you. This was wonderful. Thanks for having me.
Oh, wonderful.